Good morning, everyone. Welcome to day 2 of our Old Testament seminar. Yesterday I began by exploring with you the notion of what I've called the covenant pyramid. And we looked at the nature of that revelation, beginning with creation, which I established as the base. Again, imagine that's a pyramid. Creation is the foundation from which God begins. And from that foundation, he builds a series of stages in biblical revelation that lead ultimately to the fulfillment in Jesus the Messiah. We looked at creation, what that meant. We looked at the fall and its consequences when Adam and Eve disobeyed God by eating the fruit of the forbidden tree. And we looked at the arrangements that God made, as it were, with Adam. There would be serious consequences. The image of God would be marred. Physical death would enter creation. And then we saw that there would be a lack of harmony in marriage, and marriage as an institution would come under threat. Work would become a drag, and it would become something less than the ideal. Did that mean that God had given up? Not at all. For he would establish that the seed of the woman would ultimately crush the head of the serpent, and that seed was Jesus. Then we looked at Noah, and we saw that God, the consequences of sin had worked themselves out, and God brought a universal flood that destroyed the entire earth. Noah, his family, was spared, along with male and female pairs of animals. And from that second start, God, as it were, resurrected the life of the human race. We now want to move to the next stage, the third stage, and Abraham, followed by Moses. Abraham, of course, is one of the great patriarchal figures of the Old Testament. His part in the covenant redemptive plan of God was that he was the recipient of one of the greatest promises that God had ever made to a human being. Now, those promises, and again, we won't have time, folk, given our restricted time frame, to look at all of these passages in detail, but they are critically important. So we have with Abraham is the one who received the promise of God's redemptive plan. And what was the nature of the promise? There were actually 3 elements here, and I want to share with you those as we move along. The key passages, and again I simply encourage you to look at these in the time available to you. And I may just mention, of course, that after each of these sessions you will have had and you will have a time for group discussion. You will have a chance to explore the group that's given those particular set of questions on Abraham's promise stage will be able to work their way through. But there are 3 elements of this promise that I want to briefly share with you. And they are as follows. The first promise relates to land. The second relates to progeny, offspring. And the third relates to reputation. Now again, because the data is fairly lengthy, I simply don't have time to go through all of those relevant details. But let me point out just a few salient points. First of all, there is the promise of the land. In Genesis chapter 15, the middle section of this particular promise, let me just summarise, if I may. There is a spectacular revelation that God enters into with Abraham at this point. And Abraham is put into a deep sleep. God gives him the promise. Let me just read you 1 or 2 verses to introduce this. Verse 4 of chapter 15. Then the word of the Lord came to him. This man will not be your heir, but a son coming from your own body will be your heir. Abraham was told that he would have a son. At that stage, Abraham was 99 years old. His wife Sarah was 90, well beyond the age of childbearing. Abraham sought to have a child with his maidservant, which was culturally acceptable for the day, but that child would not be the child of promise. So God then, we return, verse 5, chapter 15. God took Abraham outside and said, "Look up at the heavens and count the stars, if indeed you can count them." Then he said to him, "So shall your offspring be." Abram believed the Lord, and he credited to him as righteousness. And then he goes on to give him a promise. And he says that he will give him the promise of the land. That was promised in chapter 12. But how does God guarantee it? Well, there's now a spectacular vision. Let me take you through it. It's in chapter 15. God puts Abram into a deep sleep, having instructed Abraham to divide the carcasses of animals and lay them in a corridor, as it were. And he brought these, and there was a goat, a ram, and a heifer, each of them 3 years old, along with a dove and a young pigeon. So Abraham literally divides the carcasses from head to toe, lays them opposite, and so you get a kind of a carcass corridor. It's a bit gross, but nonetheless, that's what it is. And then what happens? Abram goes into a deep sleep, verse 12. And then there's a thick and dreadful darkness comes over him, we read. And God said to him in verse 13, "Know for certain that your descendants will be strangers in a country not their own, and they will be enslaved and mistreated 400 years. But I will punish the nation they serve as slaves, and afterwards they will come out with great possessions. You, however, will go to your fathers in peace and be buried at a good old age," etc. Now, verse 17. When the sun had set, the darkness had fallen, a smoking firepot with a blazing torch appeared and passed between the pieces. The vision of fire and the smoking firepot are commonly represented in the Old Testament as what we call a theophany. A theophany is a visual appearance of God in a physical form. This was a theophanic representation of God, and he passes between these divided carcasses. Now, forgive me, but I won't be able to in detail explain this to you, but I want to give you a reference that you might follow up. If you go to Jeremiah chapter 34, Jeremiah chapter 34, and have a look at the process there. Dividing animal carcasses and walking between those carcasses is a sign, it's a, if you like, a symbolic sign of making a solemn vow to God. Now this was done with the people of Israel. But God does it here, and he does it in this dream vision given to Abraham. And what does it mean? He is saying that I solemnly swear to keep this promise. Now here it is, verse 18, back to Genesis 15. On that day, i.e. the smoking firepot passing between the pieces of the divided animals, on that day the Lord made a covenant with Abram and said, "To your descendants I give this land, from the river of Egypt to the great river, the Euphrates, the land of the Kenites, Kenizzites, etc." So what is happening here is that God, in this theophany, is promising Abraham that he will carry out his promise and give him a land. He will have an enormous progeny, innumerable descendants, and they will occupy that land. And God says, in effect, if I don't keep those promises, then I am dead. Now that, of course, is an unthinkable blasphemy. But God commits himself. What's our definition say? A relationship between God and man, sovereignly initiated. God laid down the terms of this covenant with Abraham. Abraham had no part in discussing the conditions. He certainly had to sign on the dotted line, so to speak. It was fulfilled by God alone and maintained by God because God kept his promise. In all three areas, God agreed. God kept his promise to Abraham, gave him a land, gave him innumerable descendants, and he had a worldwide reputation. A reputation of a faithful servant of God. And so it is that when we come to this, again, looking at the definition of our covenant, I made the point at the outset that each stage of this covenant revelation fulfills the terms of the definition. And the last part of that definition, it involves a commitment for life and death from both God and man. Is it not interesting here that in God, walking between the pieces of the carcass in the form of a smoking fire pot, makes a commitment to death if he breaks his promise? Now, Abraham is well aware that if he too disobeyed God, then he would forfeit those promises and indeed sign his own death warrant. Now, of course, as we know, Abraham was a faithful man. Not a perfect man, but a faithful man. We saw the same thing with Noah, and God promised that he would never again flood the earth. The rainbow is the sign of that promise. And so we see here in this stage of promise, it relates to the most marvellous provision. The final element of the stage of promise for Abraham is a command. And that command is circumcision. Circumcision was the seal of the covenant. Just very briefly, and I won't go through this in detail, but we have here in Genesis 17 the specific conditions of that requirement. Circumcision, of course, was the mark upon the male body after 7 days, and it marked the people of God off as his own people, bound under a solemn oath to live for him. So Abraham, the sign of the promise, and wonderful promises they were, a land to dwell in, innumerable progeny, and a worldwide reputation of faithfulness. The stage of promise. Next, we move to arguably one of the greatest figures of the Old Testament, the prophet Moses. And the prophet Moses was one who was the beneficiary and the recipient of what we refer to as the stage of law. Now again, this is an enormous body of literature. There is no way that I can adequately canvass every single aspect. But let me share with you, if I may, some of those distinctives. We have here a number of crucial passages, and they're found in the books of Exodus and Deuteronomy. And I'll just put these up for you. So we have Moses' stage of law, and the crucial passages are Exodus 19 to 24, and the next one's actually the book of Deuteronomy, all of it really, but there are a couple of passages and I'll point them out briefly as we go. When we come to look at the stage of law, it may be summed up by that extraordinary phenomenon that Moses and the people of Israel experienced in their journey in the wilderness towards the land of promise. They'd been delivered from Egypt, Exodus chapter 6, following. They'd left there, they'd been spared from invasion and defeat by the Egyptian army. They walked through the Red Sea, God divided the waters. The people of God walked through. When they got through safely on the other side, the waters collapsed, the Egyptian army drowned. From that point on, they moved and came to Mount Sinai, at which point God caused them to stop. And here, Moses received one of the greatest revelations of all time, what we now refer to as the Ten Commandments. Now, the Ten Commandments, and these are found in Exodus chapter 20, the implications of this are enormous. What I want to say to you is that the Ten Commandments function as a summary of the entire law. Now, forgive me, I haven't got time to validate this claim, but I want to suggest to you that for each of the Ten Commandments, they actually point to an element of the law that's canvassed throughout the books of Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. So each of those 10 commandments illustrates an aspect of God's law covenant relationship. The stage of law was a critical one in the history of God's people. For in it, God laid down those requirements. And you know the 10 Commandments. And of course, you may be aware, just a quick refresher, the first 4 of these relate to man's relationship with God. They have to do with worship and Sabbath observance and the abstention from idolatry, etc. The last 6 relate to man's relationship with each other. And so here are prohibitions against adultery and theft and lying, etc. And the one commandment with promises, the commandment to honour your father and mother, so that your days will be long in the land that God has given you. And so for each of these 10 words, as they're referred to, you have an aspect of God's relationship with man. The law covenant may be summarised, and there are various places. You can read this in Exodus 6 and elsewhere. But the key phrase is this: I will be your God and you shall be my people. That sums it all up. And folk, that is true today for members of the New Covenant as it was for members of the Old Covenant in Moses' time. And so the stage of law had enormous implications. What was its foundation? Its foundation was deliverance from Egypt. If you go to the beginning of Exodus 20, I won't do it now, but if you go to the beginning of that book, of that chapter, you will read the words that basically say, because I delivered you from the land of the Egyptians, this is how I expect you to live. So the law covenant was given in response to God's sovereign initiative. Here we have the relationship, this definition of covenant. That relationship between God and man sovereignly initiated. The whole basis of that revelation to Moses was based upon God's extraordinary, miraculous deliverance of his people from the land of Israel. It was maintained by God because that relationship was sustained despite Israel's disobedience and fulfilled. How do we know it was fulfilled? Well, the people of God entered the land of promise. Not in Abraham's time, not in Moses' time, because Moses in fact died before the people of God entered the land of Canaan. But Moses' trusted servant, the man we know as Joshua, did lead the people of God into the promised land. So God fulfilled his promises. And again, it involved a commitment for life and death. Certainly for the people of God, their commitment for life lay in their keeping of the commandments. For God consistently said, for as long as you keep my word and obey my laws and decrees, I will bless you. But if you don't, then all of those freedoms and all of that blessing will be forfeited. God, by implication, and again it is implied but nonetheless real, is that if he failed to keep those promises, then he was literally as good as dead. That, of course, is an unfathomable, blasphemous thought. But it is, if in fact we ever said it happened, but in fact it is proof that God's word is absolutely secure. Adam understood this. Even though his experience was negative, he was preserved. Noah was preserved. And Noah saw the blessing and the mercy of God in being preserved from the universal flood. Abraham understood that because God gave him a child, Isaac, in his old age. It's unthinkable. Imagine a man 99 years old and a woman 90. Even in those days of extended life, the thought that a woman could have a child at that age was unthinkable. But miraculously, God gave him a son. God gave Abraham a son in his old age. Land, progeny, reputation. After Abraham comes Moses, and God reveals to him the legal basis upon which the whole of God's people would come to exist and be fulfilled. Now, of course, what we see here is that there is a marvellous transformation. I am going to take the liberty, if I may, of going to a New Testament text to illustrate the connection. Now, as I've indicated before, you've got here a consistent and progressive revelation. If I can go back to the diagram for just a moment. I've made the point before, having begun with creation, we then move up through the periods of human history. Adam and Eve, Noah, Abraham, and now Moses. You'll note, and again I just want to reinforce, you see those subsidiary apexes. They in fact consistently point upwards till ultimately their fulfilment is in Jesus. And although this is a very, very short overview, I trust, folk, that I can encourage you to see the direction in which the biblical narrative is pointing us. With regard back to Moses, we see that there was a promise in the law, and even though the law was powerful, it was not the ultimate end, as it were. And here it is, if I can read this section from Galatians chapter 3, verse 15. Paul writes, "Brothers, let me take an example from everyday life. Just as no one can set aside or add to a human covenant that has been duly established, so it is in this case. The promises were spoken to Abraham and to his seed. The scripture does not say, and to seeds, meaning many people, but and to your seed, meaning one person, who is Jesus." You see, this is not something, again, just to validate, as it were. My claims here are not based on mere affirmations, but you see there is biblical warrant for making clear the connection between the stage of law and Jesus the Messiah. There is an intimate connection between the Old and the New Covenant. The two are different, but they are, as it were, irrevocably joined together. Galatians 3:15 is making the case. Let me return to the text, verse 17. What I mean is this: the law, introduced 430 years later, does not set aside the covenant previously established by God, and thus do away with the promise. For if the inheritance depends on the law, then it no longer depends on a promise. But God, in his grace, gave it to Abraham through a promise. What then was the purpose of the law? It was added because of sin, transgressions, until the seed, to whom the promise referred, had come. The law was put into effect through angels by a mediator, that was Moses. A mediator, however, does not represent just one party, but God is one. Is the law therefore opposed to the promises of God? Absolutely not. For if a law had been given that could impart life, then righteousness would certainly have come by the law. But the Scripture declares that the whole world is a prisoner of sin, so that what was promised, being given through faith in Jesus Christ, might be given to those who believe. What Paul is arguing here is that the law, what I've called the stage of law, does not revoke the promise. It builds on it. For the very nature of the law has its foundation, the blessings given to Abraham, before him Noah. Remember, folk, that if God had wiped out the earth and there was no Noah and was none of his family, then what happens? Well, God obliterates the world. He obliterates humanity. And in fact, if that had happened, he would have violated his own promise. Remember? What did we read back in the promise given to Adam? Here we are. Adam, and we read that in Genesis chapter 3. Remember what God had said? That the woman's seed will crush the serpent's head. Now, if God had wiped the world out and not spared Noah and his family, then the human race would have been eradicated, and thereby God would have had, as it were, no claim to be God, because he would have broken his promise. But that's the whole point. His promise is consistently maintained. And so again, if I can reiterate, the whole foundation of this promise, and remember, if we consider this as the base, creation is the base. Notice, and I don't wish to be pedantic and be cute, but I did this for a purpose. You see here at each corner of the pyramid, if you can conceptualize that, each of these covenant stages emerges. They all stem from the implications of creation and Adam's fall from grace. So the covenant with Adam, the covenant with Noah, the covenant with Abraham, and the covenant with Moses all have as their foundation man's fallenness. Man fell, but God never broke his promise. He always kept his word. And so it is. We find there, and finally, as we end this session this morning, the confirmation of that covenant is found in Exodus chapter 24. Now, I don't have time to look at that, but I encourage you to read it. In Exodus 24, we have the people of God committing themselves to obey the covenant. Now, in fact, history records that they failed to do so. But that's another story, and we'll leave it there for today. I look forward to catching up with you again tomorrow morning.